All right, I'm just going to jump right out the gate and say the words that are taboo that we're going to talk about in this episode. Menstruation, periods, tampons. These are all things that, sometimes you say them and they make you feel uncomfortable. They're not things that we talk about as regularly as we could or should in society. And also, if you were to in society. And if you bring them up in front of, elementary school kids, middle school kids, you're going to hear giggles. You might even hear giggles from adults. But I think that this is an important topic. And so I'm going to back up a little bit and just say, I was working on a story in issue 6 of the Good newspaper about how to empower women and people who menstruate during their periods. And I realized a few things. One, I didn't know how to spell menstruation. I kept on getting the little squiggly lines underneath the word in Google Docs. I now know how to spell menstruation. And also, the lack of access to period supplies and the things that people use on their periods is huge. There's a lot of people who don't have access to these things that are so important to a huge percentage of the population. And so I was researching the problem, which is how we always start each story in the Good newspaper. But then I started looking into who was creating solutions. And I found so many incredible organizations and individuals, but one person and one organization really stood out to me. Nadya Okamoto is the founder and executive director of Period, an organization she founded at the age of 16. Now, Nadya had an experience growing up. She found herself without a home as a teenager and saw firsthand how difficult it is for people on their period to deal with their period when they're experiencing homelessness. And so Nadya just started doing something about it. She started putting together kits with everything you need for your period. She started giving them out to organizations and people in need. And now today, Period is the largest youth-run NGO in women's health, and they're dedicated to ensuring that menstrual products are reliably available to those who need them most. It's wild. Since 2014, they've addressed over 400,000 periods and registered over 230 campus chapters to join in this meaningful work. And so I asked Nadya to be on the podcast today, and she so kindly said yes. And Nadya is fascinating. So she goes to school at Harvard in 2017. Nadya ran for office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She didn't end up winning that campaign, but her campaign team made this huge impact in mobilizing young voters on the ground and at the polls, which is amazing. Nadya is also an author. She just published her debut book, Period Power, a Manifesto for the Menstrual Movement. And most recently, Nadya was included in InStyle Magazine's The Badass 50, which is a list of women who are changing the world. And she was listed alongside Michelle Obama, Ariana Grande, and Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. And I so loved this conversation with Nadya because she has been doing this impactful work since she was a teenager. And she's really honest about what that experience is like and kind of the struggle of evolving and shifting and changing and what that does to the way you see yourself and what happens when your identity shifts and changes. We also talk a lot about periods, and I tried to just become more comfortable with how to do that. And I think I'm growing. I think I'm getting good at that, as somebody who hasn't given periods much thought in my whole life. And so I love this conversation, and I'm so glad we got to have it. I am Branden Harvey, and this is Sounds Good. This is the weekly podcast where we have conversations with inspiring people who are rejecting cynicism and using their lives to make an impact. Sounds Good isn't your typical 3 steps to success podcast. We don't host this podcast for the sake of leaving you with bullet points on self-improvement. We just believe that our lives are more complex than that. And so we show up here on Sounds Good to ask big questions, dive into nuance, and learn from each other's stories. So without any further ado, let's jump straight into my conversation with Nadya. I saw that you grew up in Portland. I love Portland. I went to Portland State, and I'm actually about to move back to Portland.
Wait, what? Why are you where are you living right now?
I'm in Nashville, Tennessee.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so you're going to move from Nashville all the way back to Portland.
Yep, doing the road trip across the country. It's going to be a wild drive, but I'm so excited to be back.
Oh, that will be fun though.
What part of Portland did you grow up in?
Right in the city.
Good. Awesome. Northeast, southeast, northwest, southwest?
Northwest.
Northwest? We're in Northwest.
I grew up in Northwest on 18th and Flanders, like right in the Alphabet District, like a few blocks from 23rd Street.
That's amazing. I was on 23rd and Irving.
Oh my God. Wait. Okay. So how long have you lived there before?
I was there like 5 or 6 years.
Oh shit. Okay. So you know the area really well.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay. Wait. So then my story, like of how I started period, like everything will make a lot of sense because it's very Portland based and like our headquarters are still there too.
What? Good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's get into it then. And I'll just actually here's kind of how I want to maybe start off. And I've never started a podcast with this question, and I probably won't start any other future podcast with this question, but can we talk about your first period?
Yes, my first period. So I got my first period when I was, I believe, in sixth grade. Yeah, sixth grade. I was, I think, 12 years old. And I remember very clearly that it was December 26th because for about 8 years, my parents being divorced, the day after Christmas every year, we would fly from Portland to New York City to visit my dad. And it was always like a really high anxiety time because, you know, there was a lot going on with my dad in terms of the abuse my sisters and I experienced with him, but not really realizing that it was abuse at the time. So it was like a lot of anxiety. And then right when we were rushing out of the house to the airport, I went to the bathroom and that's when I looked down and saw blood and like realized it was my first period. And as like an over dramatic young teenage girl, like automatically thought I was dying, even though I had known what menstruation was. I think like it's just like no one prepares you for what it actually feels like when you look down and see blood. No matter how much you know about menstruation, no one tells you about what that experience is really like, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that's got to be such a surprise, especially at that age when you're not expecting that at all.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't that I wasn't expecting it because, to be honest, my mom started telling me about periods when I was like maybe 7 years old.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
I remember she got me my first like little panty liners when I was in 4th grade. And every time I had like an emotional day, I'd be like, it's PMS. I can feel it coming. Like I was so excited to get my period because I think growing up, I was always really obsessed with the idea of being older, right? Like my mom always jokes that I always wore underwear that was like 3 sizes too big. All my clothes hung off of me when I was younger because I always wanted to wear what all the like not even what the bigger kids were wearing, but like the size the bigger kids were wearing.
Funny.
And so I think I was always really excited about getting my period and getting boobs and, you know, growing into my body.
And so that happens and you have an existential crisis and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm dying. Then you kind of come down from that.
Yeah, so I really thought I was bleeding out. And so actually like the confrontation with my mom was like, oh my gosh, like I'm like, this is really happening. I'm too young to die. Like, yeah. And it wasn't until I went out to my mom and I showed her my underwear, then she was like, you're a woman, and started doing her little happy chant around.
It seems to me that that's maybe the beginning of this story of how you came to create Period, the organization.
No, I mean, so that's not really like the story behind Period, but I think that it did play a part of like me growing up in a family that was super open about periods that I'm sure helped me feel comfortable when I did start this sort of activism.
Yes, and you had a later experience in high school it seems like that was the catalyst, right?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I founded the organization when I was 16 years old, really inspired by my family's own experience with living without a home of our own. So when I was a freshman in high school, my mom ended up parting ways with her job, and we ended up living with friends who've since become family. And since you know the Portland area, we moved to like more far out northeast side.
Okay.
And my school was more on the edge of Beaverton, so pretty far away.
The opposite direction. So you're like commuting all the way across town and then a little bit outside of town.
Exactly, yeah. So during this time of housing instability, my commute to school turned from about 12 minutes to over 2 hours long on public transportation. So I would have to usually take 2 buses to get to school. And where I would change buses was in Old Town, Portland, Oregon. So right downtown.
Yeah.
And in that area at the time, there are like 10 homeless shelters in a 2-block radius. And I would regularly see the same homeless women going to and from school. And it was really through like getting in random conversations with them, and I was never afraid to like ask them about their life story or like why they were in the situation they were in.
Why do you think that is that you felt so comfortable?
I think a lot of it is because, I'm very extroverted as a person. I think at a certain point, like back then, I remember when I was, freshman and sophomore year of high school, I didn't even have a smartphone. I had one of those slide phones, right?
Yes.
That really only had texting. So honestly, I think it was like sometimes I would get stuck at this bus stop for an hour or something because I did a lot of extracurriculars, so I wouldn't go home until pretty late when the buses weren't running as frequently. And back then, if you didn't have like Instagram or social media at your fingertips, like, I'm kind of dating myself, but like, I think it was really like spending hours at the bus stop or spending hours cumulatively with these women, and just wanting to talk, right? And so I think that sort of is where it came from. And I sort of by practice started asking them this question: what do you find most challenging about your living situation? And I think at the time I was just really fascinated with stories of hardship to like better understand what my family was going through, and try to like distract myself from what we were going through. And those conversations with homeless women were actually like a big part of, I think, what pushed me to go more into service, but also pushed me to really think about periods as well, right? Because on one hand, talking to these homeless women were actually the first time that I realized that I had grown up with domestic violence and sex abuse in my own family. Because when you grow up with that sort of behavior in your family, you don't realize it's wrong because it's all you know, right?
Mm.
And so it wasn't until I talked to these other women who like called it out for being wrong or called it out for being inappropriate or like just not okay that I think I really realized that about my own life as well. But I also think that in talking with them, I realized how privileged I was because unlike them, I had a mom who was protecting us above all. I had, my family, I had a roof over our heads, I had school, I had still like so much opportunity economically. So I think that there was a lot about those conversations that pushed me to like want to reconcile that privilege through doing service leadership. And then also by asking this question of like, what do you find most challenging about your living situation? That's where I sort of collected this accidental anthology of these stories of women using toilet paper and socks and brown paper, grocery bags, and cardboard to take care of their periods.
Wow. Okay. So you kind of came to this understanding that, hey, there's people who are living with less privilege than me, people who are living without homes, and their periods are like significantly impacting their ability to find success or thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was just hearing their stories of, literally using trash that they found to take care of their periods, or this experience of when you were on your period, just like trying to find a public restroom and sitting near it before you could really go about your day, like waiting your period out, or missing job interviews because you had your period and you only had one pair of clean pants, right? And it sort of just catalyzed this unhealthy obsession with periods I had. Like in my free time, I would just Google search keywords about period poverty. And it's through that I learned about like the global scale of period poverty, of like periods being the number one reason why girls miss school in developing countries and a leading cause of their dropping out of school, getting married early, undergoing female genital mutilation or social isolation. And like really reading these stories about how, even today, like 4 people now have died in 2019 because of practices around menstruation of social isolation, right? And even in the US, learning that period-related pain was a leading cause of absenteeism for girls here in the US more than the common cold. And then in 2014, now the number's 35, but then 40 states in the US had a sales tax on period products because they're considered luxury items, but products like Rogaine, Viagra, and penile pumps were considered essential goods.
And so they weren't taxed, but these things that every single human who menstruates are being taxed.
Yeah, so it was like the more necessary products being considered non-essential goods, so inherently like these luxury items. And so the sales tax applied to them, considering them a luxury, yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, and so all of these things are building up, and what are the emotions that you're feeling around this? I mean, you're effectively seeing injustices. What's your internal response?
So, I mean, on an emotional level, like, I think they're sort of twofold. First of all, I had never really been so passionate about an issue to the point where, like, it sort of became everything I thought about, right? Like, I mean, obviously, I grew up in a family where, like, my mom always wanted us to have an opinion about something, right? Like, it was a dinner table practice that all of our placemats from the time I was a kid had, like, all 50 states on them or all of the presidents, and we had to talk about them. And when I got to middle school, it was like every day we would bring a topic that we learned about to the table to, like, discuss, right? Like, my mom always was really trying to to foster this sort of, you know, hyper intellectual conversation as much as you can be at age 10, right? um, but I mean, so I was always knew about, like, social issues, always knew how to have an opinion about them. But this was the first time that I had learned about an injustice and just felt with this burning passion that not only, like, we needed to do something about it as a global population, but specifically I had to do something about it, right? And then on a personal level, I think in feeling that sort of fire within me was also the first time that I think I really felt like my personal potential in my voice, right? Like, feeling like
Hmm.
I can do something to make a change, right? And at the age of 16, I found myself in some really tough situations where, like, you know, at age 16, I was coming to terms with the fact that my relationship with my dad was really abusive, and I wasn't ready to talk about it publicly. It actually didn't really come out until a few years later. But it was when I first started to think about it. But also at the age of 16, I found myself in a really abusive relationship with someone where, like, rape and sexual assault and physical assault were a regular part of my life. And I think that that really manifested in my feeling like my self-worth really came from my body. And it wasn't until I really, like, felt this passion and fire about period poverty that I think I felt like my worth is so much more than my body, because I felt like I needed to say something about it. And by saying something, I could make a change. And I think that was really, like, even just learning about period poverty was really the first time that I felt like this burning potential that I wanted to live up to.
I think that's so remarkable that you had all of these, things happening in your life that were affecting you, but then you were still seeing these issues that were affecting other people. And you said, I'm going to go and I'm going to work to do something about these things that are affecting other people, even though I think it would have been completely valid for you to just turn completely inward and focus on those, really heavy issues that you were experiencing.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that, I mean, obviously it would have been easier to not do anything about it. But I think that, like, it was the sort of thing where I started realizing it in everywhere around me, right? Like, I would notice not only think about the issue of period poverty, but watch how, like, when my girlfriends, even if no one was around, needed a tampon or a pad, like, they would whisper about it, right? Like, we would all
Hmm.
talk about periods as a bad word. Or, like, I would catch myself like, in class, if I needed to go to the bathroom to, like, change a period product, I would bring my whole damn backpack with me, right? Or, like, just so that people didn't see the products. Like, I just sort of realized how the stigma manifested in my own life.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting thing because I know that I grew up with that stigma as a dude who doesn't menstruate. And I've only recently started to just like feel more comfortable just talking about, I'm like married to a person who menstruates. I, have siblings and family who all these things. And it wasn't, until like the last few years where I started to like try to intentionally break that stigma because I don't know. I feel like it's really strong, especially with guys. And so to hear that it's true also just in the company of just, people who menstruate, I think that shows how strong of a taboo there is.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I think a lot of that manifests just from, like, how most of us learn about periods, right? Like,
Mm,
still today, there's no requirement that periods are taught in school, but when they are, it's usually in gender segregated classrooms where, like, the girls are in one room, the guys are in another. So
yeah.
the guys never learn about it, and the girls instead learn that you only talk about it with other girls behind closed doors, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that a lot of it is just manifested from a very, very young age. But also just that, like, because it's not an open conversation, people who don't menstruate, just there's no need for them to really know about it, right? And I think what we're trying to do as an organization is fight for this idea that this is not a women's issue, this is a human issue that we all need to be talking about and feeling comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's so beautifully said.
Like beyond that, I think it's also fighting for like eliminating gender even as like a binary thing in this conversation, right? Like realizing that not only women menstruate, but also people who don't identify as women can also menstruate as well, right? Like people who might be transgender or non-binary can also get their periods.
Yeah, yeah, and I've been trying to be intentional about, the pronouns I use and descriptors because, there are a lot of people who get left out of that conversation. And, those people are usually people who are already facing a lot of, probably discrimination and being left out in a number of other ways. And so, leaving them out of a conversation around something that's already taboo for, other folks, I think, I don't know. It's something that I think is worth being really intentional about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like it's something that even I catch myself doing. Like I think it's really important as someone in any place of privilege to come into every conversation feeling really humble in their experience, but also really knowing that they don't know everything. They should ask questions if they don't know and always be listening to learn more, right? Like when I started this organization, I was not even aware about the need to be gender inclusive. And it's been a big learning experience of needing to take a step back, empowering other people who have the actual experience of not being cisgender and getting their periods, and just wanting to learn as much as I can.
That's amazing. And I feel like that's such an interesting thing about anytime that you start something, you come in from such a genuine, authentic place and you have to figure out you've got to figure out what you've got to figure out, basically. There's so much more to learn. And for you to continue to be in a place where you're willing to listen and be humble, even though you've been, doing this for years, I think that's really huge.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
So you are in high school. All of these things are kind of hitting you at once, and you're realizing, I want to do something about this. And so you begin to do something. Like, tell me about what kind of the early stages of you trying to make a difference in this issue looked like and kind of how that's evolved through the years.
Yeah, so I decided that I wanted to start a nonprofit, not really knowing what that meant, but just knew that the word like nonprofit meant like doing something good, right? So I decided that I wanted to do that. And my first step was finding a co-founder because I remember my mom like warning me that there was so much like other work beyond just like the activism, but like the operations, the finances. So I basically just found the guy in my class who I knew of as just being super nice, but also being the first kid done with Excel spreadsheets in math class and then walking around and helping everyone else, right?
This is in high school? You just like go to a
This
classmate?
is in high school.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
So in high school, I just like went up to a classmate, pitched them my idea, and he basically had interest in wanting to start something, but didn't really know what he wanted to start it. So he automatically said yes. And then he told me later, like a few days later when we met for our first like get together, that he didn't even know what a period really was, right? But at the age of 16, we like embarked on this journey together, and we met at a Starbucks that Saturday. It was actually our first ever conversation outside of the classroom. Until then, we had one class together. We had Chinese class, and he was always the best in that Chinese class, and I was always the worst. And we literally sat there looking up questions like, what is a nonprofit? What is the IRS? What is a board of directors? What's a 501c3? And we literally sat down and filled out all of those forms ourselves, incorporated ourselves, became a 501c3 ourselves, and just had my mom and his dad sign off because we weren't old enough to sign any of the forms. But that's really how we started. And it was really just like doing anything we could to solve the simple solution of getting period products to people who need them.
Wow, that's amazing. And so practically, you start filling out forms and stuff, but like what are the practical ways that you are getting people the period products that they need when you're a high schooler? What does that look like?
Yeah, it was raising money. Like I would try to raise money in any way I could, whether that be on social media or pitching to people at staff meetings or anything like that. So I think it was a lot of fundraising, anything like small amounts, buying period products from every Dollar Tree, Walmart in the area, getting our friends together to put together packages of period products, and naturally posting on social media about what we were doing. And within a matter of months, we had messages from hundreds of students and journalists from all over the country who wanted to know more and bring this to their own area. And I think it was really that that experience that pushed us to grow nationally within a matter of a month, right? Like we wrote down everything we did in our community and said, replicate this in your own. And that's how our chapter network was born.
And I was looking at that little page on your website. It's not a little page. I was looking at the page on your website of how many chapters there are. And how many states are you guys in right now?
So I think we're in 50 states now.
Wow. And it's not just like one in each state. It's like 25 in some, like it's crazy.
Yeah. And that website page is actually not updated at all.
Well, that's amazing.
So, sort of as a recap on what Period is now, we're now a global youth-run NGO that fights to end period poverty and stigma through service, education, and advocacy. So what that means is we distribute period products to people in need. We try to change the way people think, talk, and learn about periods through education. And we're now working in policy from the local to the federal level, passing legislation with city councils and school governments all around the country, getting period products into school restrooms to be treated as a necessity just like toilet paper. At the state level, we're developing campaigns to repeal the tampon tax in the 35 states where it still exists. And at the national, we continue our advocacy and trying to fight for like food stamps to cover period products as a necessity, which they don't currently.
Oh, interesting. You're fighting for more accessibility ultimately in all these different avenues.
Yeah, and since founding Period at the end of 2014, we have now addressed over 490,000 periods through product distribution through hundreds of partners all around the country and around the world, and 15 other countries as well. And we have 280 campus chapters at universities and high schools around the US and abroad. So according to this Forbes article that just came out, they confirmed that like Period is now the largest youth-run NGO in women's health in the world now.
That is incredible. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's been really amazing just to watch. And I think like when I started, like none of my plan was to go beyond Old Town Portland. And it's crazy to realize like how global we are now.
Tell me about how that happens where, you know, you're just trying to make a difference in literally this place that you're taking the bus through, that, you know, that you're seeing with your own eyes. What does it feel like to expand beyond that?
I mean, I think to be honest, like I've never been the person who takes time to reflect and be like, wow, we've come so far. We've done so much. Like I'm such a workaholic in the way of like, I don't reflect as much on the successes, but I'm always like, what are the things we didn't do as well in the last 3 years and what can we be doing better in the forward to make sure that we're doing everything we can to maximize our potential, right? And I think that it's really in thinking in that way that Period has been able to grow so fast because we've always been very focused on what we can be doing more.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so what do you kind of feel like is next for you? Like, what are the things that you feel like you can do more?
I think that I'm really excited to have like my book I published my first book in October called Period Power.
So exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, so I signed with Simon & Schuster and just released it called Period Power Manifesto for the Menstrual Movement. And it's been really amazing to just see how having a book has been able to build our audience in a really strong way, but also create more unity within the movement, right? Now we have chapters who feel like we're working off of the same manifesto, right? Like I wrote this book to be like, here's what we're doing in our community and why we need to be doing it, right? And it's been really amazing to see the sort of unity that we've been able to catalyze over the last year. And I'm really hoping we can do that even more going forward.
That's amazing. And then I know that beyond just, you know, your work with Period, you're doing kind of other work outside of that. And recently you ran for office in Massachusetts, in Cambridge.
Yes.
What inspired you to run for office?
Yeah, so I ran for Cambridge City Council in 2017. And I was 19 years old, freshman in college. And it really sort of came from that same attitude of being really angry about housing affordability in Cambridge, and then, you know, downloading every publicly accessible report on like income inequality and gentrification and just building the sort of interest in doing more. and frustration with the current city council that they weren't doing enough about including student voices as well. So yeah, founded this campaign team, and we ran this grassroots campaign, knocking on about 20,000 doors in the area, and ran against
Wow.
26 other candidates. We didn't win in the end, but we made history with student and youth turnout in that area, and that was honestly enough for me to feel really happy about it.
Well, isn't it remarkable how you can accomplish things without winning? Like without being number one in any avenue of life, you can still move the needle. And it sounds like you really, you got a bunch of youth engaged in a way that they had never been before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like that's what the campaign experience taught me, was the sort of realizing that like the actual winning isn't always the most you can get out of that situation, right? Like even in looking at how, for example, like in how when my book came out, I was so anxious and struggling with imposter syndrome of like, why am I writing this book? No one will read it. And I think like book sales have been hard because it's such a niche category. But I think really trying to push myself to just be really thankful for the opportunity to write a book and publish one.
Yeah, I think that's a really remarkable way of thinking about it because yeah, you're right. You can't necessarily compare such a niche thing to, Harry Potter or, like whatever it is. But the people who are reading it are going to be so deeply impacted. And so you just get to continue to move the needle one person by one person.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's my hope. But I mean, it's hard, right? Because like, I think I've always been a really competitive person, like with myself. And so have always wanted to push myself to do better, like be the biggest and the best, right? And I think it's been a learning opportunity of like knowing how to really think about what it means to maximize impact, right? Like less about the big numbers, but more about how deep
Yeah.
you're going with each individual person.
Earlier, you talked about how growing up, you always just wanted to be older. You wore, older kids' clothes, all these things. Do you feel like that's still true for you? I mean, you're still young, but do you feel like you're settling into where you're at?
No, okay, so when I was younger, I always wanted to be older, and now I want to be younger because I think so much it's not even about aging or anything like that. It's that so much of my core identity over the last few years has been being a young activist, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm like running period, being the teenager who ran for office, like being the young person who signed to write a book. And um, now I'm chief brand officer at Juve Consulting, which is a Gen Z marketing agency that works with companies all the way from small ones all the way up to big ones like Microsoft and Unilever and Verizon, right? Like, and we employ hundreds of young people all around the country to talk to companies about how to market to young people, right? So much of my professional and personal identity has been around being a young person. And so I think that it's not even my concern about being aging, but it's sort of that fear of now needing to, like, now that I'm 21, I know I'm still young, but like sort of preparing myself to strengthen a new identity of maybe being someone who empowers young people or young activists or finds ways to maximize the maturity I have and the older audience that I can connect with in doing this work. But I think that there is a lot of fear that I have. I mean, even in turning 21, of realizing that like I'm not a a teenager anymore.
Yeah, it is hard when your identity shifts and this thing that people always have known you for maybe isn't true anymore or is becoming less true and trying to figure out, okay, what are the core parts of me that will never change? How can I continue to lean into those things while also leveraging the strengths of the things that I am right now, but may not be tomorrow?
No, for sure. And I think like that's something I think about a lot of like even when it comes to my role with period, like actually something I'll be announcing more strongly over the next month is to actually taking a step back from the executive director role at period and focusing more on the advocacy, right? Because
Mm.
I never thought that I'd be running a global organization. And to be honest, I don't love it. Like I love that period is global, but being the executive director of a global organization means fundraising a lot, doing a lot of admin work, like project managing and people managing now full-time staff, right? Which is a big honor and really exciting, but it's not why I got into this work, right? Like I really got into doing this work because I wanted to talk about periods and work in the real world with other people and brands to spread the mission of this menstrual movement. And so I'm actually going to be taking a step back, hiring a new executive director on so that I can move back into focusing my time on being sort of the spokesperson and also recruiting more brands to maximize our potential as as a movement, but also focusing my efforts on designing a national effort to repeal the tampon tax in the US.
That's amazing. And I think it's also worth mentioning that on top of all of these things that you're doing, you are also still in school. Is that correct?
No, so I'm actually taking time off from Harvard. So I'm
Okay,
a rising
cool.
junior at Harvard College, but with the book coming out and everything, and honestly just feeling a little bit burnt out after the campaign,
Yeah.
I'm taking some time off from college. And so I'm tentatively going back in the fall, although I've really been struggling with that over the last few weeks, because every week a new person announces running for president, and I think I would drive myself a little bit crazy being stuck on campus watching the presidential election unfold.
You want to be a part of the campaign.
Or not even a part of the a specific campaign, but I want to be a part of. I think the presidential elections are a huge opportunity where civic engagement increases, where people are paying attention to politics more, where you start having these public figures who are being more politically engaged with their platforms. And I truly believe that this is a really pivotal election, especially for women's rights and reproductive rights. And I think that I'd want to be a part of the advocacy around reproductive rights woven into the narrative around the presidential elections.
That is a really interesting point to think about how you could, who knows what it would look like or what it would take to get, one of these leading candidates to essentially start as a part of their platform, including, repealing the tampon tax and making, period supplies more accessible. That would be fascinating.
Well, I mean, and it would be my dream for it to be on all of their platforms, right?
100%.
On both sides. But yeah, I think ultimately, would love the final presidential candidates to have this as something that they champion.
I think that's so amazing, and I love how you have this very holistic vision of how you can, focus on the things that you want to focus on. If it takes starting an organization, you start an organization. If it takes, putting things into PACs to give to other organizations, you do that. If it takes running for, for office, you're doing that. And if it takes being, an advocate during a political season, you're doing that. And I think it just shows your focus and your drive on this issue that you care about and has affected you and it affects so many people. And
well, I think sort of on that, I think I'm always asked, in all these interviews, what would you tell someone, a younger person who's trying to take action like this? And I always joke that I sort of just sound like a Google and Nike ad, because I truly believe the only reason I've gotten to, or not the only reason, but in terms of an attitude, mindset, the reason I've gotten to where I am today is because if I didn't know something, I would just Google it, right? If I didn't know how to run for an office, or even if I could run for office, if I didn't know how to write a book, I was Googling how to publish a book. I Googled how old do you have to be to run for office? What are the requirements? So much of the answers are at our fingertips, and social media is a huge resource. And I think my other aspect is just going for it and not really thinking too much about the self-doubt you might have, right? I think so much of what I see holding my peers back is this fear that you don't have enough qualifications, or you don't have the right degrees, or you don't have the right professional experience. And I think wanting to push people to just go for it, and if they're passionate about something, to just do it.
all right, that was a great conversation. I'm so glad that I got to have Nadya on the podcast, and I'm so glad we got to dive into a topic that we don't normally dive into on this podcast. But ultimately, it centers on these same ideas of what do you do when you're confronted with injustice? What do you do when injustice knocks on your front door? Do you become cynical? Do you shut down, or do you do something about it? And sometimes doing something about it is as simple as, going to the grocery store, buying some tampons and giving them to some organizations. And sometimes that small first step leads to creating a huge global organization. What a beautiful story. Make sure that you check out what Nadya is doing by visiting period.org or following them on social media at Period Movement. And then you can also follow Nadya at Nadya Okamoto on Instagram and Twitter. And check out her book, Period Power, a manifesto for the menstrual movement, available wherever books are sold. If you're new to Sounds Good, we would love for you to stick around. I think you'd also love my conversations with two other women who started doing good at a young age. Specifically, I'm thinking of Katie Myler and Sarah Lee. You can find both of these episodes and more than 100 other episodes. Actually, more than 100. I think we just hit 150 episodes. That's amazing. That's incredible. By searching for Sounds Good wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure that you hit subscribe to keep on getting more inspiring conversations with incredible people delivered straight to your phone while you sleep. This podcast is created by me, Branden Harvey, as a part of Good, 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 a community that believes in the power of celebrating good news and becoming good news. Chad Michael Snavely and the team at CM Studio edit and mix the show. You can get lots more hopeful stories on social media by following us everywhere at GoodGoodGoodCO, and you can also follow me on social media. I'm at Branden Harvey. We also create a beautiful quarterly newspaper that celebrates the people, ideas, and movements that are changing the world for the better. You can check out our newest issue, which includes a little story about how to empower women during their periods. You can check it out and see everything else that we do at goodgoodgood.co. And on that note, that is a wrap for this week's episode. Go out and Google stuff and then just do it. And we'll be back next week with another inspiring story from an incredible person. Sound good?